Okay, happy Wednesday, day after a storm. Here's 9 questions, a reach back for grade 8 math. Now these 9 questions have to do with chapters you've already covered in either grade 8 or in grade 7. So the middle question is actually a grade 7 question, but the rest of them are all grade 8 questions because they have to do with fractions and integers and algebra. So as we go through these, I'm going to make each of them worth a certain number of points because I want you to be sure that you show proper work for them. So make sure as I show you my work that what I write and what you write is almost identical. So the first question is an integer question. It says -4 plus 3 groups of -2. We know from our experience that when we have more than one operation in a mathematical expression, we have to use BEDMAS or order of operation. So it's going to be, for 1 point, you need to have written down on your piece of paper -4 plus -6. That's worth a point. And finally, 1 more point for the answer of -10. So if you had all of that work shown, give yourself 2 points out of 2, right? In the second question, it says -2 multiplied by 10 minus 14. So the first part of BEDMAS we're going to do here is our brackets. And of course, 10 minus 14 is not +4, but rather -4, because you're taking away more than you have. That's worth a point for showing that step. And finally, your last step is to multiply those two, and you get +8 as your answer. So that question is also worth 2 points. Now, your next question is a little bit tricky because technically you could find a common denominator and change to equivalent fractions and divide the numerators and cancel the denominators, but we're just going to keep the first fraction and change to multiplication by the reciprocal. Now on your paper you probably had over 1. You don't need to write that, but if you did multiply by the reciprocal, you would need to have that somewhere written down, and you would also need to have your answer of 3/16. So again, multiplying by the reciprocal, showing that you multiplied by the reciprocal is a point, and having the answer of 3/16 is a point. So the third question is worth 2 points as well. Now we digress. Actually, the fourth question, I made a mistake. The fourth question here, 1 2/5 plus 3/8, is not a grade 8 question, but it's a reach back to grade 7. In grade 7, you did one of 2 things. You could have added the whole number and the 2/5 and then added the 3/8. You could have done that, brought down your whole number and just concentrated on the 2/5 plus 3/8. That's one thing to do. So because there are multiple ways to do it, I'm going to make this question worth less than it should be. What I taught you to do is simply think of all fractions as being improper if they're mixed. Find your common denominator, which in this case the lowest common multiple they share is 40. That's a 0. Make equivalent fractions of 56/40 and 15/40. And when you added the numerators and kept the denominators, you would have 71/40, which we learned through lots of experience that you do not keep your answer as improper. You recalibrate it as a mixed, and therefore your final answer would be 1 31/40. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to give 1 point for that work right there, and 1 point for the improper, and 1 point for the mix. So everything that's boxed there is going to be worth a point. And I'm not going to worry about whether you put mixed. Now, if they had a mixed fraction, it's fine. But we're going to make this worth 3 out of 3 for work. Okay? So there's 3 points up for grabs. As long as they showed me equivalent fractions in some capacity. They might have kept the 1 separate, and if they did, that's okay, because they would have had 16/40 instead of 56/40, right? But either way, you end up with a final answer of either 71/40 as improper or 1 31/40 as mixed. In your next question, your grade 7 question, it says lowest term fraction is 1/5. What is it as a decimal and as a percent? Now, there's 2 ways you could have done it. You could have taken your fraction, which I'll bring over here, 1 divided by 5, and you divide the numerator by the denominator, and it will tell you it's 2/10. So your answer is 2/10. But a smarter person would have said, you know what, hang on a second, let me just say, if I said, well, 1/5 is equal to how many tenths? And the answer is 2/10. And I said, hold on a second, 2/10, that's 0.2. You could have written the decimal form without division and just wrote it as an equivalent fraction with a 10 denominator and read it and known that it was 0.2. And because it's 2/10, it would also be 20 hundredths if I put an insignificant zero down, which would make it as a percentage, 20%. In the next part, this is 22 hundredths, right? Tenths position, hundredths position. So 22 hundredths is your non-lowest term fraction. Now this LT here means lowest terms. So because 22 over 100 is not lowest terms, you would have to write it as 11 over 50, which is your lowest terms. Now if the person put 22 over 100 and didn't reduce it to lowest terms, you can give them a half a point. But make sure you circle the LT up here and draw an arrow so they don't make that mistake tomorrow when it actually counts for something. And because 22 over 100 is a fraction of 100 and percents are out of 100, we know that that would be 22%. And finally, 12% as a lowest term fraction. Well, as a non-lowest term fraction, we know that 12 out of 100 is 12%, but then we're looking at it, we're like, that's not lowest terms. What is the largest factor or largest number that's divisible into both 12 and 100? The answer is 4 is the largest, which would mean in lowest terms, 3 out of 25 is your lowest term fraction. Again, if they had 12 out of 100, take a half point off for not reducing it to lowest terms. And finally, 12 out of 100 is 12 hundredths, which is tenths, hundredths, 0.12. So that question is out of 6, yeah. Make that question out of 6. Question 6 is a mixed fraction multiplied by a mixed fraction. Now, if we think about modeling, you don't have to, but if you think about it, remember how we did this. We said this distance here was 2 from here to here. This was a fifth. This distance from here to here was 1. And then we calculated the individual areas and then added them up to express the same value as a mixed fraction multiplied by a mixed fraction. But the easier way, of course, is to convert them both into improper fractions as opposed to mixed. So 1 point for showing the conversion to mixed, or from mixed to improper, excuse me. 1 point for multiplying the numerators and denominators to get 77 twentieths as an improper fraction. And 1 point for showing it as 3 and 17 twentieths as a mixed fraction. That is worth 3 points as well. So 3 out of 3. 1 point for this, 1 point for this, and 1 point for this. Your last 3 questions are from the chapter we're currently working on, and we're almost done. We're just getting ready with our practice test. So all 3 of these questions are expectations you should have learned how to do by now. So in the first, or in all of the last 3 questions, we have 2 or 3 step equations, depending on how you want to look at it. In the first one, x divided by negative 2 plus 1 is equal to 3, or a negative half of x plus 1 is equal to 3. We learned through experience, Ava, that the easiest way to isolate the variable in 2-step equations is to get rid of the constant first. So our constant here is plus 1, so I'm going to subtract 1 from both sides. I'm going to have a negative half of x is equal to 2 as my second step. So 1 point for every line you have, so this line here, if they have that line with the minus 1 underneath it, that's worth a point. And they had to rewrite it like this. The second point will come from both sides being multiplied by negative 2, because the opposite of dividing by negative 2 is multiplying by negative 2. So that's your second point. And your third point comes from the answer x equals negative 4. So that question there is worth 3 points. Just consider one line's point, that's a point, and the answer is a point. In your next question, negative 7 is equal to 4 minus 2x. What's your constant in that equation? Positive 4. So we're going to subtract 4 from both sides and put a line through it. That's your first point. Okay. Once we have that, we can rewrite that as a negative 11, because negative 7 and negative 4 make negative 11, equals negative 2x. A lot of mistakes will be made right here. They'll think that's a positive 2x, but it's actually a negative 2x. Our second step requires us to divide both sides by negative 2. And x will equal a positive 5.5, or 5.5. Because half of 11 is 2, or half of 11 is 5.5, and a negative divided by a negative is a positive. So 1 point for this line, 1 point for this line, and 1 point for x equals 5.5. So that's worth 3 points as well. And finally, our last question is our distributive property. There are two ways to solve it. So what I'm going to do here, I'm just going to clone it twice. I'll just clone it. I'll bring it down, and we'll solve it two different ways. How many of you expanded to solve? Multiplied both terms inside the brackets by -2. How many divided both sides by -2? All of you. All right, well, I'm going to show you, I'll show you that method first. So what this says is -2 groups of -2x plus 1 is equal to -6. So if you use division first, you divided both sides by -2, and that's where the point, and then rewrote the fact that I don't have -2 groups anymore. I have one group of that is equal to a +3. Okay, +3. Then what I would do is I'd just do my two-step equation, add 1 to both sides. That's worth a point. I'll bring this down a little bit more. You get -2x equals 4, and divide both sides by the coefficient of -2, and your final answer is x equals -2. 1 point for this line, 1 point for that line, 1 point for that line, and 1 point for your answer, x equals -2. So this question is worth 4 points. Okay? If we did it the other way, with expansion, which is okay to do, what I would like to see if you choose expansion, you have to do it, and you have to be able to do it both ways, so it's important that you do note that there's two ways to do it. I was just told I made a mistake. Let's go back in time. I stink. Let's go back. I added 1 to get rid of +1 constant. Rookie mistake. I should have subtracted 1 from both sides. -2x equals 2. Then divided both sides by -2. And x will equal -1. My mistake. So again, it's still worth 3 points. 1 point, 1 point, 1 point, 1 point. 4. Now, alternatively, you didn't divide. You could have used expansion, which, as I was saying before, I realized I made a mistake, is something you have to demonstrate as well. You have to demonstrate both methods for solving a distributive property question, not just your favorite. So -2 times -2x is what this first arrow is telling us in our distributive property. And if I think about ignoring the signs, if I had 2x and I doubled it, I'd have 4x. We all know that. And a negative times a negative is a positive. So -2 times -2x is +4x. And the second arrow says, what is -2 times +1? It is -2. So that's what we'll have for this, equals -6. So 1 point if they chose to use expansion for that statement there. Then 1 point for adding 2 to both sides and a line, 4x equals -4. And finally, 1 point for dividing both sides by 4, and your final answer of x equals -1. So 1 point for this, 1 point for that, 1 point for that, and I guess 1 point for having the arrows, I suppose. That's worth 4 points. So somebody asked me what it's all about. So this, and this, that's 10 points, plus 19, 22, 24, 26. Is it 28? Is that right? It's at a 28. So put a score at a 28, and hopefully you do well tomorrow.